Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the actual mechanics of global conflict. We're going to be looking at one of the most consequential military coalitions in all of human history, and that is the Central Powers of World War I. You know, when we study history, we tend to focus a lot on the battles and the generals, right? But the hidden architecture of war, well, that usually lies in the ink of treaties and the psychology of nations. So let's explore how defensive pacts that were genuinely meant to deter war ended up making it absolutely 100% inevitable.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. 1. The alliance trap. 2. Forming the Central Powers. 3. A global imperial network. 4. The cost of conflict. And finally, number 5, disintegration and defeat.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the alliance trap, roots of World War I. To really understand 1914, we actually need to look backwards a few decades. There's this historical precedent that perfectly illustrates how tangled alliances can escalate into absolute catastrophes. If we look back at the Crimean War in the 1850s, historians have noted a pretty fascinating pattern. Leaders of that era, guys like Tsar Nicholas I and Napoleon III, they basically couldn't retreat from a conflict without losing their domestic prestige and completely compromising their national security. Russia felt it needed a subservient Ottoman Empire just to stay secure, while Britain needed an independent Ottoman Empire to lock down the Eastern Mediterranean. So it was mutual fear, not mutual aggression, that served as the true catalyst for that massive conflict.
And this brings us to a vital concept we call the alliance trap. Think of it as a dynamic where empires are essentially forced into war to uphold these complex defensive pacts that, ironically, were built on a foundation of fear in the first place. When a nation's prestige and their basic security become totally dependent on backing up their allies no matter what, well, any tiny regional spark can ignite a global powder keg. It's like a giant set of dominoes. This exact psychological and diplomatic trap perfectly set the stage for the outbreak of World War I.
Moving right along to Section 2, forming the Central Powers, building the coalition. Let's see how this very trap built the Central Powers and triggered a chain reaction that literally engulfed the world in flames. The core origin of the Central Powers was the dual alliance of 1879 between Germany and Austria-Hungary. Fast forward to July 1914, right after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Austria-Hungary sends this insanely punishing ultimatum to Serbia. When Serbia doesn't fully comply, because of course they wouldn't, Austria-Hungary declares war. Why? Because they were terrified a South Slav rebellion would completely tear their multinational empire apart. Now watch how fast this all spirals. Germany backed Austria-Hungary, Russia backed Serbia, and within mere weeks, a rapid-fire succession of mobilizations locked all these empires into a massive conflict. By October 1914, the Ottoman Empire, which was bound by a secret treaty with Germany, officially jumped in after a naval raid on Russian ports. A year later, in October 1915, Bulgaria joined the whole shebang, mostly lured by the promise of grabbing territory in Vardar, Macedonia back from Serbia.
The actual mechanics of how this unfolded are super important to understand. When Russia ordered a general mobilization to protect Serbia, Germany viewed it as a direct, unacceptable provocation. Facing this absolute nightmare scenario of a two-front war, Russia in the east, France in the west, Germany hits the panic button and enacts the Schlieffen Plan. This strategy meant German troops had to swing south into France by marching straight through Belgium. But here's the catch. Belgium was neutral, and their neutrality was guaranteed by a very old 1839 treaty signed by Great Britain. So by violating that treaty just to get to France, Germany essentially forced Great Britain to declare war. The alliance trap had snapped completely shut. There was no going back.
Okay, Section 3, a global imperial network beyond Europe.
Now, this is where we really need to shatter the traditional, highly Eurocentric myth of the First World War. This wasn't just some localized conflict fought exclusively in the muddy trenches of France and Belgium. Not at all. The Central Powers were global empires with territories literally spanning the earth, and it created an absolute logistical nightmare for everyone involved. Take the German Empire alone. It was vast. Down in Africa, they controlled Togoland, Cameroon, Southwest Africa, and German East Africa, which covers modern-day Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. Over in Asia, they held the Jiaozhou Bay territory leased from China. Out in the Pacific, they controlled German New Guinea and German Samoa. So the moment war broke out in Europe, the conflict instantly spread like wildfire to all these distant territories as Allied forces moved in to capture them. It turned a European family feud into a truly worldwide struggle. And get this, to actively divert Allied military resources away from those European fronts, the Central Powers threw financial and military support behind a surprisingly diverse network of rebel factions all around the globe. They were backing the Senussi order fighting the British in Egypt, and the Sultanate of Darfur in Sudan. They sent aid to the Zayan Confederation, who were actively resisting French expansion in Morocco, and funneled weapons to the Dervish state in Somalia. Actually, they even provided support for radical Irish nationalists who launched the famous Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916. The Central Powers basically knew that tying down Allied troops in far-off colonial skirmishes gave them a much-needed strategic edge right back at home.
Let's get into Section 4, the cost of conflict, a massive mismatch.
To really grasp the nature of this war, you have to look at the sheer scale of the mismatch between the two sides. I mean, from day one, the Central Powers were fighting a massive, massive uphill battle. Think about this. In 1914, the combined population of the Central Powers was just over 156 million people, with a combined GDP of around $384 billion. The Allies, well, they commanded a staggering population of over 793 million people and a GDP of nearly $1.1 trillion. That is insane. The Allies possessed nearly 5 times the population and almost triple the economic output. So the Central Powers were operating at a massive economic, industrial, and demographic disadvantage right out of the gate.
But despite that crazy economic mismatch, the military mobilization of the Central Powers was just an astonishing feat of logistics, and honestly, grim determination. Together, they somehow managed to put over 25 million men into uniform. Germany alone mobilized over 13 million soldiers, while Austria-Hungary called up nearly 8 million of their own. All of these men were just poured into a relentless, brutal war of attrition, facing off against deadly, brand-new industrial technologies.
And the human cost of this new industrial warfare? It was absolutely staggering. Of those 25 million men mobilized, the overall casualty rate, and by that I mean killed, wounded, or missing, was an estimated 75%. 75%! Germany saw 71% casualty rate, but the most horrifying toll was on Austria-Hungary. They suffered a devastating 94% casualty rate among their mobilized forces. 94%. Just pause and imagine that for a second. Almost every single young man in your town, your city, or your country either killed, wounded, or missing. It's almost incomprehensible. An entire generation of young men from these empires was essentially wiped out or forever altered by the trenches.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5. Disintegration and defeat, collapse of empires. As the war dragged on way longer than anyone initially expected, the early solidarity of the Central Powers really started to crack, and this led directly to their total collapse and a complete reshaping of the modern world. The breaking point actually started down in the Balkans. Bulgarian troops were just completely exhausted by 3 years of static positional warfare. They were starving, they were heavily targeted by pacifist propaganda, and morale was in the dirt. So, when Franco-Serbian troops launched this massive breakthrough offensive on the Macedonian front, the Bulgarian lines just shattered. Germany tried to rush reinforcements down to Sofia, but honestly, it was completely hopeless. Bulgaria became the very first of the Central Powers to sign an armistice in late September 1918. And that triggered a fatal domino effect. Within mere weeks, the Ottoman Empire fell, then Austria-Hungary collapsed, and finally, Germany itself surrendered on November 11, 1918.
Now, there wasn't just one neat, unified treaty to end the whole thing. Instead, there was a series of deeply punishing agreements that meticulously dismantled these once massive empires. You've probably heard of the Treaty of Versailles. That one severely restricted Germany's military and slapped them with massive financial reparations. But then you have the treaties of Saint-Germain and Trianon, which completely dissolved the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Get this, they stripped Hungary of a staggering 72% of its land. 72%. Meanwhile, the Treaty of Sevres attempted to partition the Ottoman Empire, which immediately backfired, sparking the Turkish War of Independence and eventually leading to the Treaty of Lausanne. The map of the world was literally redrawn forever. So, we've seen how these defensive alliances, forged completely out of mutual fear and a desperate need for security, ironically laid the exact groundwork for a global catastrophe, a trap that claimed millions of lives and toppled ancient empires. And I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on as we look at our own modern world. Look at all the military pacts and defensive coalitions that span the globe right now today. Are they building lasting peace? Or are we still just as susceptible to the alliance trap? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.